Defenders of Amon Sûl, an epic tale of Middle-earth. In the days when Gil-galad yet held dominion over Lindon, and the shadow of Sauron had not yet fallen upon the lands of men, there stood upon the weathered summit of Amon Sûl a company of watchers whose names have been forgotten by the songs of later days. Yet in those times, when the kingdom of Arnor was young and the blood of Númenor ran strong in the veins of its lords, these guardians were counted among the most valiant defenders of the realm. The tower of Amon Sûl, called Weathertop by the men of Bree, rose like a gray finger against the sky, its stones hewn from the living rock of the hill itself. Within its highest chamber burned the chief of the 7 Palantiri of the north, the seeing stone that was the eye of Elendil's realm, through which the lords of Annúminas could look far into the eastern lands where darkness gathered. At the head of these watchers stood Thrandion, son of Beregar, a man of noble bearing whose lineage traced back to the shiplords of Númenor. His hair was dark as the wing of the raven, and his eyes were gray as the sea in winter. Beside him served his kinsman Aldenor, whose skill with the bow was renowned throughout the North Kingdom, and Dunhere of Cardolan, whose strength of arm was matched only by his steadfast heart. Yet, it was not these captains alone who held the tower against the gathering storm. With them stood Morwen the Wise, one of the few women to serve among the Dunedain of the north, whose knowledge of the ancient lore was surpassed by none save the Eldar themselves. Her counsel was sought by lords and common folk alike, for she had walked in the gardens of Númenor ere the wave came, and her memory held secret that time had all but erased. The fifth among their number was Barahir, called the Wanderer, whose feet had carried him through all the lands between the misty mountains and the sea. He knew the speech of many peoples and the ways of the wild, and his coming to Amon Sûl in those days was accounted a great fortune, though none knew what fate had driven him there. Upon a morning in the stirring of the year, when the sun had not yet burned away the mist that clung to the valleys below, Thrandion stood upon the watchtower's crown and gazed eastward through the clear air. The Palantir lay shrouded in its chamber below, for the hour of the seeing was not yet come, yet already his heart was heavy with foreboding. "The lands grow dark," spoke Morwen, ascending the narrow stair to stand beside him. "In my dreams, I have seen shadows walking where no shadow should fall, and heard the sound of marching feet where no army treads." Thrandion nodded gravely. "The reports from our riders speak of strange happenings in the wild. Villages stand empty without sign of struggle, and the beasts of the forest flee westward as though pursued by some terror they cannot name. From the eastern horizon there came a glimmer of light, pale and cold, that seemed to dance upon the air like marsh fire. Yet this was no natural flame, for it moved with purpose, drawing ever closer to the watchtower where they stood. "What manner of light is this?" asked Aldenor, his hand moving instinctively to his sword hilt. Before any could answer, the light suddenly blazed forth with such intensity that all were forced to shield their eyes. When the radiance faded, there stood before them a figure robed in white, tall and fair, with eyes that held the light of the 2 trees. "Ereinion Gil-galad sends greeting to the watchers of Amon Sûl," spoke the newcomer, and his voice was like the sound of silver bells upon the wind. "I am Elrond Half-Elven, herald of the High King, and I bear tidings that may not be delayed." Thrandion bowed deeply, for he recognized the herald of whom songs were sung even in the courts of men. "Lord Elrond, you are welcome in this place, though I fear the news you bring is dark indeed, if it has brought you so far from the havens of your lord." "Dark tidings indeed," replied Elrond, his fair face grave with concern. "The enemy stirs in his fortress of Barad-dûr, and his servants walk openly in the lands of the east. But more than this, a power long thought broken has begun to wake in the mountains beyond Moria, and the very stones of the earth cry out in warning." The words of Elrond fell upon the watchers like a shadow cast by wings unseen, and for a moment none spoke, each lost in thought of what such tidings might portend. The herald of Gil-galad stood silent, his keen eyes watching their faces as understanding dawned. "What power do you speak of, Lord Elrond?" asked Morwen, her voice steady, though her heart raced with sudden dread. "What sleeps in the mountains that should not wake?" Elrond's gaze turned eastward, as though he could see through stone and hill to the very roots of the misty mountains. In the deeps beneath the dwarf realm of Khazad-dûm, there lies a creature of shadow and flame, a thing that should not be. The dwarves delved too deep in their greed for Mithril, and in their tunneling they have disturbed that which was bound in the foundations of the world. "A Balrog?" whispered Dunhire, and his face grew pale. "I have heard the old songs, the demons of Morgoth that were cast down in the ruin of Beleriand." "Even so," said Elrond gravely, "and though it sleeps still, the bonds that hold it grow weak. The servants of the enemy know of this, and they work to rouse it from its slumber. Should they succeed, the flame of Udun will be unleashed upon the world once more." Thrandion felt a chill run down his spine, and he looked upon his companions with new understanding. "This is why we have been called to Amon Sûl, is it not? Not merely to watch, but to act against this threat." "Your wisdom serves you well, son of Beregar," replied the herald. "King Gil-galad has seen much through the Palantir of Elostirion, and his heart is troubled. The watchtower of Amon Sûl stands at the crossroads of the ancient ways, and from here the paths lead to all the realms of the free peoples. If the enemy's servants would wake the Balrog, they must pass through these lands." Barahir, the wanderer, who had remained silent throughout this exchange, stepped forward. "What would you have us do, Lord Elrond? We are but 5, and our strength is that of mortal men. How can we stand against the servants of Sauron and the flame of the ancient world?" "You are not alone in this task," answered Elrond. "Even now, riders go forth from Rivendell and Lothlorien, and the king himself girds for war. But you who hold this tower are the eyes and ears of the realm. You must watch for the signs of the enemy's coming, and when the time arrives, you must act to prevent the awakening of the shadow." Morwen stepped closer to the herald, her eyes bright with sudden understanding. "You speak of prevention, my lord, but what if we are too late? What if the Balrog has already begun to stir?" Elrond's face grew grave, and for a moment the light in his eyes seemed to dim. "Then we must be prepared to face what comes, as our fathers faced the darkness in the days of the War of Wrath. But let us not speak of such things unless they come to pass." The herald reached within his robes and withdrew a crystal wrapped in silver cloth. "This is a gift from the Lord of Rivendell, a shard of the evening star, blessed by the light of Arendil. Should the shadow fall upon you, it will be as a beacon in the darkness. Guard it well, for such things are not lightly given." Thrandion accepted the crystal with reverence, feeling its warmth pulse gently in his hands. "We will not fail in our duty, Lord Elrond. The Watchers of Amon Sûl will stand firm against whatever evil may come." "Of that I have no doubt," replied Elrond. "But remember, courage alone will not suffice in the trials ahead. You must be wise as well as brave, and trust in the bonds that unite you. The enemy's greatest weapon is discord, and he will seek to turn friend against friend if he can." As the herald prepared to depart, Aldenor stepped forward. "My lord, what of the other watchtowers? Are we the only ones who have been warned? The southern towers have been strengthened, and the lords of Gondor prepare for war," answered Elrond. "But the burden of watching falls heaviest upon you, for through these lands the enemy's servants will come if they seek to reach the dwarf realm. Be vigilant and trust in the wisdom of those who have gone before." With these words, Elrond mounted his horse, a creature of such beauty that it seemed wrought of starlight and silver, and rode swiftly away toward the west. The Watchers stood in silence upon their tower, each lost in thought of the great task that lay before them. 7 days passed after the departure of Elrond, and the Watchers of Amon Sûl maintained their vigil with heightened alertness. The spring air carried strange scents from the east, not the clean smell of growing things, but something darker, like the breath of deep cavern where no wholesome thing had ever dwelt. It was Barahir who first noticed the change in the behavior of the birds. The ravens that had long nested in the crags of the weathertop began to gather in greater numbers, their harsh cries echoing across the hills at all hours. Yet these were not the common ravens of the wild. Their eyes held a malevolent gleam, and they watched the watcher with an intelligence that spoke of corruption. "They are spies," said Morwen, observing the blackbirds from the tower's parapet. "The enemy has many servants, and not all walk upon two legs. These creatures carry word of our movements to their master." Thrandion nodded grimly. "Then we must be more cautious in our comings and goings. The time of open watching is past. Now we must learn to guard ourselves, even as we guard the tower." That night, as the moon rose full and bright above the hills, Aldenor took his watch upon the eastern wall. The silver light revealed the landscape in stark detail, the rolling downs that stretched toward the misty mountain, the dark line of the great east road, and the scattered copses of trees that dotted the wilderness. It was in the third hour after midnight that he saw them, riders moving swiftly along the road, their forms dark against the moon-washed earth. They rode in formation, with the discipline of soldiers, yet there was something in their bearing that spoke of evil purpose. Aldenor counted their number, 12 riders, all mounted upon horses that seemed to drink in the moonlight rather than reflect it. Their leader bore a banner that fluttered in the night wind, though the device upon it could not be discerned from such distance. Moving with the silence of a hunting cat, Aldenor made his way down from the walls and wakened his companion. Within moments, all 5 watchers stood upon the tower's height, their eyes fixed upon the approaching riders. "They make for the bridge at Mithithil," whispered Dunher. "If they cross there, they will be in the wild lands beyond our sight." "Not if we can prevent it," replied Thrandion. "Barahir, you know the secret paths. Can you reach the bridge before they do?" The wanderer studied the rider's progress with calculating eyes. "Aye, if I leave now and take the hill path. But I cannot face 12 armed men alone." "You will not be alone," said Thrandion. "Aldenor, take your bow and go with him. The rest of us will hold the tower and watch for other movements." The 2 men departed swiftly, vanishing into the darkness like shadows among shadows. Thrandion turned to his remaining companions, his hand resting upon his sword hilt. "What think you of these riders, Morwen? Are they servants of the enemy, or merely brigands who ride by night?" Morwen shook her head, her face troubled. No common bandits would ride with such purpose, nor would their horses move with such unnatural silence. "These are Nazgul, the ring-wraiths of whom the old tales speak, or else servants of similar darkness." Meanwhile, Barahir and Aldenor made their way swiftly through the night, following paths known only to those who had wandered long in the wild. The wanderer moved with the sure-footedness of one who had walked these hills for many years, while Aldenor followed close behind, his bow strung and ready. They reached the bridge at Mithithel just as the eastern sky began to show the first pale hints of dawn. The ancient span of stone crossed the river in a single graceful arch, its surface worn smooth by countless years of wind and weather. "There," whispered Barahir, pointing to a cluster of standing stones upon the western bank. "We can conceal ourselves among the stone and watch their approach." They had barely settled into their hiding place when the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the water. The riders came into view, their forms more terrible in the growing light than they had appeared from the tower. Their leader was tall and grim, clad in black mail that seemed to absorb the light around it. His face was hidden beneath a hood, but from its depths came a pale radiance that hurt the eyes to look upon. "Nazgul, indeed," breathed Aldenor, his hand trembling slightly as he knocked an arrow to his string. "I can feel the cold of their presence, even from here." The riders paused at the bridge's eastern end, and their leader raised his head as though scenting the air. When he spoke, his voice was like the sound of wind through an empty tomb. "I smell the fear of mortal men," he said, his words carrying clearly across the water. "They watch us from the shadows, thinking themselves hidden. Come forth, spies of the West, and face the servants of the Dark Lord." The words of the Nazgul Lord fell upon the morning air like a curse, and Aldanor felt his heart race with terror such as he had never known. Beside him, Barahir's face had gone pale as death, yet the wanderer's hand remained steady upon his blade. "He knows we are here," whispered Aldanor, his voice barely audible above the sound of the flowing river. "Then we must make our choice," replied Barahir grimly. "We can flee and report what we have seen, or we can stand and fight, though the odds be hopeless." The Nazgul Lord urged his fell steed forward onto the bridge, and the very stones seemed to crack beneath its hooves. Behind him, his companions followed in silent procession, their black banners streaming in the wind like wings of carrion bird. It was then that Aldanor remembered the teachings of his youth, when the lore masters of Fornest had instructed him in the ancient ways of war. "The Nazgul fear fire and running water," he said suddenly. "The bridge spans the Mythethel. If we can prevent them from crossing, they must seek another way." "But how?" asked Barahir. "We are but two, and they are many." Aldanor's eyes gleamed with desperate inspiration. "The bridge is old, and the stones are held together by mortar that has weathered many winters. If we could strike at the keystone." Without waiting for a reply, he rose from concealment and drew his bow to its full extent. The arrow flew true, striking the Nazgul Lord's mount in the shoulder. The creature reared with a shriek that pierced the morning air, and its rider fought to control it as it danced perilously close to the bridge's edge. "Fools!" cried the Nazgul Lord, his voice filled with rage. "You dare to strike at the servants of the Dark Lord? Your deaths will be slow and filled with torment." But Aldanor was already nocking another arrow. This one aimed not at the riders, but at the ancient stones of the bridge itself. The arrowhead was of steel from the forges of Westernest, and it struck the keystone with such force that cracks spread outward spider's web. Barahir understood at once, and he too rose from hiding, casting aside stealth for desperate action. In his hand gleamed a blade of Númenórean make, its edge keen enough to cut through stone. With a cry that rang across the water, he leapt onto the bridge and struck at the weakened keystone with all his strength. The blow fell true, and the ancient mortar crumbled like sand. The bridge shuddered, and for a moment it seemed as though it might hold. Then, with a sound like thunder, the central span collapsed into the rushing waters below. The Nazgul Lord's mount screamed as it plunged into the river, bearing its rider down into the swift current. The other wraith pulled back from the crumbling edge, their hollow cries echoing across the water as they watched their leader struggle in the foam. "You have won nothing!" shrieked the Nazgul Lord as the current carried him downstream. "The bridge may be broken, but there are other ways. We shall remember this deed, and when next we meet, your suffering will be beyond measure." Barahir helped Aldanor to his feet, for the archer had been thrown down by the bridge's collapse. Both men were bruised and shaken, but their hearts were light with the joy of victory against impossible odds. "We must return to the tower," said Barahir. "The others will have heard the sound of the falling stone, and they will fear for our safety." They made their way back through the hills as swiftly as they could, arriving at Amon Sûl as the sun reached its zenith. Thrandion met them at the gates, his face grave with concern. "We heard the sound of battle," he said. "What befell at the bridge?" "The Nazgul sought to cross the Mythethel," replied Aldanor, still breathing hard from their swift journey. "We brought down the bridge and cast their leader into the water, but they still live, and they will seek another way." Morwen stepped forward, her eyes bright with interest. "You fought the Nazgul and lived? This is a deed worthy of song. But tell me, what banner did they bear? What device was upon their standard?" Barahir frowned, trying to recall the details of what he had seen. "It was a black banner with a red device. A hand, I think, though I could not see it clearly in the darkness." "The red hand," whispered Morwen, her face suddenly pale. "That is the sign of the mouth of Sauron, the Dark Lord's most terrible servant. If the Nazgul ride under that banner, then the enemy's plans are further advanced than we feared." Thrandion placed a hand upon his sword hilt. "What does this mean for our mission? Are we to stand against the mouth of Sauron himself?" "Not yet," replied Morwen, "but his servants grow bold, and they move openly in the lands of the west. We must send word to Rivendell and to the courts of men. The time of hiding is past. Now we must call upon all who would stand against the darkness." As they spoke, Dunheré pointed toward the eastern sky, where dark clouds were gathering despite the clear morning. "Look there," he said. "The very heavens grow troubled. I fear that worse things than Nazgul are stirring in the deep places of the world." The storm that gathered in the east was unlike any that the Watchers had seen before. The clouds moved with unnatural speed, swirling and twisting as though driven by some malevolent will. Lightning flickered within their depths, but it was not the clean white fire of heaven. Instead, it burned with a sickly red light that hurt the eyes to look upon. "This is no natural tempest," said Morwen, studying the approaching darkness. "There is sorcery in those clouds, and the touch of the enemy's hand." Thrandion nodded gravely. "Then we must seek counsel from the Seeing Stone. The Palantir of Amon Sûl has remained silent since the coming of Elrond, but perhaps now it will show us what we need to know." The 5 Watchers descended into the heart of the tower, where the Palantir stood upon its pedestal of black stone. The Seeing Stone was a perfect sphere, smooth as glass and dark as night, yet within its depths strange lights flickered and danced. "Who among us has the skill to look into the stone?" asked Dunheré. "I have heard that only those of the blood of Numenor can master the Palantiri, and even then at great peril." "I will attempt it," said Thrandion. "My lineage traces back to the ship lords of the West, and I have studied the ancient lore. If the stone will speak, it will speak to me." Gaedru. Morwen placed a warning hand upon his arm. "Be careful, my friend. The Palantiri are dangerous, and in these dark times, they may show more than we wish to see. The enemy has his own Seeing Stone, and through them, he can reach across the void to touch the minds of those who look unwarily." Thrandion approached the stone with reverence, his hands trembling slightly as he reached out to touch its surface. The moment his fingers made contact, the Palantir blazed with light, and visions began to flow through his mind like a river of fire. He saw the misty mountains, their peaks shrouded in darkness. Deep beneath the roots of the world, something stirred, a thing of shadow and flame that had slumbered long ages. The Balrog of Morgoth was beginning to wake, roused by the chanting of dark sorcerers who had come from the east. The vision shifted, and he saw the ruins of an ancient city built into the mountainside. This was Khazad-dûm, the dwarf realm of old, now empty and haunted. In its deepest halls, figures in black robes moved with purpose, their hands weaving spells of summoning and awakening. "What do you see?" whispered Morwen, her voice seeming to come from a great distance. "The servants of the enemy," replied Thrandion, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining contact with the stone. "They have reached the dwarf realm, and they work to wake the Balrog. But there is more. I see a figure among them, one who commands the others." The vision focused upon a tall figure clad in black mail, his face hidden beneath a helm of iron. In his hand, he bore a staff topped with a red gem that pulsed with malevolent light. When he spoke, his voice was like the sound of grinding stone. "The time grows short," said the figure. "The Balrog stirs, and soon it will wake. When it does, we shall have a weapon to break the power of the West. The kingdoms of men will fall, and the free peoples will be driven into the sea." Thrandion tried to see more, but suddenly the vision changed. A great eye appeared in the Palantir, burning with flame and malice. It looked directly at him, and he felt its terrible gaze piercing his soul. "So," spoke a voice that seemed to come from the very foundations of the world, "the Watchers of Amon Sûl dare to spy upon the servants of Sauron. You have seen much, son of Beregar, but you have also revealed yourselves. Now you are known to me, and my servants will come for you." The contact was broken, and Thrandion staggered back from the Palantir, his face pale with shock. His companions rushed to support him, for he seemed on the verge of collapse. "What happened?" asked Aldenor. "What did you see? The enemy knows we are here." gasped Thrandion. "The Palantir showed me his servants in the dwarf realm, but when I looked too deeply, Sauron himself looked back. He has seen our faces, and he knows our purpose." Morwen's face grew grave. "Then we are in great peril. The Dark Lord does not suffer spies to live, and he will send his servants to destroy us." "But we have gained knowledge as well," said Thrandion, his strength slowly returning. "The Balrog has not yet awakened, and there may still be time to prevent it. We know where the enemy's servants are, and we know their purpose." Barahir stepped forward, his weathered face set in determined lines. "Then we must act swiftly. If we can reach the dwarf realm before the awakening is complete, we might yet thwart their plan. It would be a journey of great peril," warned Morwen. "The paths through the misty mountains are treacherous, and they will be watched by the enemy's servant. We 5 alone could not hope to overcome the sorcerers who work in the depths." "Then we must find allies," said Thrandion. "There are still those who remember the old alliances, the elves of Rivendell, the rangers of the north, perhaps even the dwarves themselves. We cannot face this threat alone." As they debated their course of action, the storm clouds drew ever closer, and the first drops of rain began to fall. But this was no clean water from the heavens. It fell like tears of blood, staining the stones of the tower red. "The very sky weeps for what is to come," said Dunhir, watching the crimson rain stream down the wall. "The awakening of the Balrog will bring such darkness as the world has not seen since the fall of Gondolin." The blood-red rain continued to fall throughout the day, and as evening approached, the watchers of Amon Sûl prepared for a night of vigil. They had seen enough omens to know that the enemy's servants would not be long in coming, and they made ready their defenses as best they could. It was as the sun set behind the western hills that a lone figure approached the tower, moving with the silent grace of one who had long walked the wild path. He wore the gray cloak of a ranger, and his face was weathered by wind and sun. Upon his breast was pinned a silver star, the badge of the Dunedain of the North. "Hail, watchers of Amon Sûl," called the stranger as he drew near. "I am Aragorn, son of Arathorn, and I bear word from the chieftain of the Dunedain. May I enter your tower and speak with your captain?" Thrandion came down from the walls to meet him, and the 2 men clasped hands in the manner of kinsmen. "You are welcome here, ranger. I am Thrandion, son of Beregar, and these are my companions. What news do you bring from the north?" Aragorn's face was grave as he spoke. "Dark tidings indeed. The chieftain has received word from his scouts that strange creatures walk the night, wolves that run upright like men, and men who howl like wolves. They come from the direction of the misty mountains, and they seek something in these lands." "We have seen signs of the enemy's movements," replied Thrandion. "Only this morning we cast down the bridge at Mithethil to prevent the crossing of the Nazgul. But tell me, what brings you to us? Surely the chieftain did not send you merely to bear warning." The ranger's eyes gleamed in the torchlight. "The chieftain has received word from Rivendell. Lord Elrond requests that the watchers of Amon Sûl be reinforced, for he fears that a great trial approaches. I am to place myself at your service, and others will follow if the need grows great." Morwen stepped forward, her keen eyes studying the newcomer. "You are young to be a ranger, son of Arathorn. What lands have you walked, and what have you seen in your wanderings?" Aragorn smiled grimly. "I have walked from the Shire to the borders of Mordor, my lady, and I have seen things that would turn your hair white with fear. But I have also seen hope. The light still burns in the secret places, and there are those who remember the old oaths." "What news of the dwarves?" asked Barahir. "We have learned that the enemy's servants work in the depths of Khazad-dûm. Do any of Durin's folk yet live in those halls?" The ranger's face darkened. "The dwarves fled from their ancient home long ago, when shadows began to walk in the deepest tunnels. They say that their miners delved too deep and too greedily, and that they wakened something that should have remained sleeping. The few who escaped speak of fire and shadow, and of a terror that drove them from their ancestral halls." "Then "The way is clear for the enemy's servants," said Thrandion. "They can work their sorcery without fear of interference from the dwarves." "Not entirely," replied Aragorn. "There is one who still walks the halls of Khazad-dûm, Balin, son of Fundin, who was of the company of Thorin Oakenshield. He leads a small band of hardy dwarves who seek to reclaim their homeland. They know not of the danger that stirs in the depths, and they will have need of warning." Dunhir stepped forward, his hand upon his sword hilt. "Then our path is clear. We must go to the aid of Balin and his company, and together we must prevent the awakening of the Balrog. The path through the Misty Mountains perilous," warned Aragorn. "The passes are watched by the enemy's servants, and the weather grows ever more treacherous. We would need to travel swiftly and silently, avoiding the main road." "I know the secret ways," said Barahir. "There are paths known only to the rangers and the elves, roads that were made in the elder days when the world was young. But they are dangerous, and not all who walk them come to their journey's end." As they spoke, a new voice joined their council. From the shadows of the tower's entrance stepped a figure clad in robes of deep blue, her hair silver-white in the torchlight. It was Morwen, but her appearance had changed. She seemed taller, more graceful, and her eyes held a light that spoke of great age and wisdom. "I have heard your word," she said, her voice carrying a strange music. "And I tell you now that the time for hiding is past. I am not merely Morwen the Wise, as you have known me. I am Miriel of the Eldar, daughter of the House of Feanor, and I have walked Middle-earth since the days of the Two Trees." The Watchers stared in amazement, for they had known her as a mortal woman, wise beyond her years, but still subject to the doom of men. Now she stood revealed as one of the firstborn, and her true nature explained much that had seemed mysterious about her. "Why have you hidden your true self from us?" asked Thrandion, his voice filled with wonder. "Because there are those among the servants of the enemy who remember the old hatred," replied Miriel. "The sons of Feanor are not forgotten in the halls of Angband, and there are those who would seek vengeance for deeds done in the elder day. But now, the need is too great concealment." Aragorn bowed low before the elf lady. "My lady, your presence brings honor to our company. With your wisdom to guide us, we may yet hope to succeed in our quest." "Indeed," said Miriel, her eyes bright with purpose, "for I have knowledge that may prove vital. I know the secret ways into Khazad-dûm, paths that were made by the elves in the days of friendship between our peoples. Through these ways, we may reach the heart of the mountain without alerting the enemy's servants." The revelation of Miriel's true nature cast a new light upon their council, and the Watchers found themselves looking upon their companion with fresh eyes. The wisdom that had seemed remarkable in a mortal woman was now understood to be the accumulated knowledge of ages, and her counsel took on new weight. "Tell us of these secret ways," said Thrandion. "If there is a path into Khazad-dûm that the enemy's servants know not, it may be our only hope of preventing the awakening." Miriel moved to the center of the chamber, and with a gesture of her hand, she conjured an image in the air, a map of light that showed the Misty Mountains in perfect detail. The peaks rose like spears of silver, and the valleys between them were filled with shadow. "Behold," she said, her voice taking on the cadence of ancient lore. "In the days when Gil-galad was young, and the friendship between elves and dwarves was strong, there were many paths between our realms. Not all were hewn by the picks of Durin's folk. Some were made by the Eldar, using arts that are now forgotten." She gestured, and a line of golden light appeared upon the map, winding through the mountains like a thread of starlight. "This is the Mythithal Pass, known to your people as the Redhorn Gate. But there is another way, older and more perilous, that leads through the very heart of the mountain." A second line appeared, this one silver and shimmering, that seemed to plunge deep into the earth. The elves called it Keled Zarum Enadain, the Path of the Second-born. It was made as a gift to the dwarves, that they might have a secret way to their deepest hall. But it has been long forgotten, and even the dwarf lords know not of its existence. Aragorn studied the map with keen interest. "How comes it that you know of this path, my lady?" "The friendship between elves and dwarves ended long ago, in the days of the kin strife." "Because I helped to make it," replied Miriel simply. "I was young then, even by the measure of the Eldar, and I delighted in the crafting of beautiful things. The path was wrought with song and starlight, and it will endure until the ending of the world." Barahir leaned forward, his weathered face creased with concern. "A path made by the elves might not welcome the feet of mortal men. What perils might we face in walking this secret way?" "The path itself will not harm you," said Miriel, "but it was made for stealth, not for comfort. It passes through the very bones of the mountain, and in some places the way is narrow beyond imagining. There are chambers where the walls close in like a tomb, and others where the path crosses chasms that have no bottom." "And at the end?" asked Thrandion. "Where does this path emerge within Khazad-dûm?" Miriel's expression grew grave. "It opens into the chamber of Mazarbul, the hall of records, where the dwarves kept their most precious writing. If Balin and his company have indeed returned to the mountain, they would surely have made this chamber their stronghold. Then we may find allies waiting for us," said Dunhere hopefully. "The dwarves are mighty warriors, and with their aid we might stand against the enemy's servants." "Do not be too quick to hope," warned Miriel. "The way is long and dark, and much may have changed since last I walked those halls. The shadows have grown thick in Khazad-dûm, and not all who enter come forth again." Aragorn rose from his seat, his hand moving to his sword hilt. "When do we depart? The enemy's servants will not wait for us to complete our preparation." "We leave at dawn," said Thrandion. "We have delayed too long already, and every hour brings the awakening closer. But first, we must make ready for a journey into the deep places of the world." The companions spent the remainder of the night in preparation, gathering supplies and weapons for the perilous journey ahead. Miriel wove protective charms upon their gear, while Aragorn saw to the sharpening of blades and the testing of bowstrings. As the first light of dawn broke over the eastern hills, the 6 companions stood ready at the gates of Amon Sûl. The tower would stand empty for the first time in many years, its watchfires cold and its halls silent. "Who will tend the Palantir while we are gone?" asked Aldenor. "Surely we cannot leave the Seeing Stone unguarded." "The stone will guard itself," replied Miriel. "It was made by the Eldar in the days of our strength, and it will not suffer the touch of evil while we are gone. But we must shroud it in silver, that its light may not be seen by unfriendly eyes." This was quickly done, and the Palantir was wrapped in cloth of silver that gleamed like moonlight. The Watchers sealed the chamber with words of power, and then they turned their faces eastward toward the misty mountain. The journey to the secret path would take them through the wild lands beyond the last bridge, where few travelers dared to go. The way was long and filled with peril, but they had no choice. The fate of Middle-earth hung in the balance, and they alone had the knowledge to prevent the awakening of the Balrog. As they walked, Miriel began to sing in the ancient tongue of the Eldar, her voice weaving a spell of concealment about them. The song was old beyond measure, dating from the days when the world was young, and the elves walked in the light of the 2 trees. "What does she sing?" asked Thrandion, listening to the haunting melody. "She sings of hidden ways and secret paths," replied Aragorn, who had some knowledge of the Eldarin tongue. "She asks the spirits of the mountain to remember the old friendship and to grant us safe passage through the dark places." The song continued as they walked, and it seemed to the mortal men that the very air grew lighter around them. The shadows retreated from their path, and the wild creatures of the hills watched them pass with eyes that held no malice. But behind them, unseen but not unfelt, other eyes watched their going. The ravens of the enemy circled high above, their harsh cries carrying word of the travelers' movement to ears that were eager to hear it. For 3 days the companions traveled through the wild lands, following paths that had been old when the kings of Númenor were young. Miriel led them with the sure-footedness of one who had walked these ways in the elder days, while Aragorn and Barahir ranged ahead and behind, watching for signs of pursuit. The weather grew ever more foul as they approached the mountains. The sky was dark with unnatural clouds, and the wind carried strange scents, not the clean smell of snow and stone, but something fouler, like the breath of charnel houses. At night, they heard the howling of wolves, but these were not the voices of natural beasts. The sounds were too deep, too full of malice and intelligence. "The enemy's servants know of our coming," said Aragorn as they made camp on the third night. "The wolves that howl in the darkness are not mere beasts. They are the werewolves of Sauron, and they hunt with purpose." Miriel nodded gravely. "The corruption spreads faster than I had hoped. The awakening of the Balrog draws near, and its influence reaches out to touch all the creatures of shadow. We must reach the secret path before they can surround us." It was on the fourth morning that they came to the shores of Heled-Zaram, the Mirror Mere that lay at the feet of the misty mountain. The lake was dark and still, its waters reflecting the gray sky like a sheet of polished metal. No wind stirred its surface, and no bird sang in the silence that surrounded it. "Here lies the entrance to the hidden path," said Miriel, pointing to a cliff face that rose sheer from the water's edge. "But first, we must cross the lake, and that will not be." Thrandion studied the dark waters with growing unease. "I see no boats, and the lake is too wide to swim. How are we to cross?" "There is a way," replied Miriel, "but it requires trust, and it may cost us dear. The lake is not empty. Something dwells in its depths, something that was old when the world was young. The dwarves called it the Watcher in the Water, and they feared it greatly." Barahir's weathered face grew pale. "You speak of making a bargain with this creature? What manner of being is it?" "No one knows for certain," said Miriel. "Some say it is a remnant of the elder days, when strange things walked in the waters of the world. Others believe it is a guardian set by the Valar themselves to watch over the secret places, but all agree that it is ancient and powerful, and that it suffers no trespass upon its domain." Dunher gripped his sword hilt tightly. "Then how are we to pass? If this creature guards the lake, it will not let us cross without a fight." "Not a fight," said Miriel. "A test. The Watcher judges all who would pass, and it grants passage only to those who prove themselves worthy. But the test is different for each who faces it, and not all who attempt it survive." Aragorn stepped forward, his gray eyes steady. "Then we must each face this test alone? What manner of trial does the creature set?" "It looks into the heart and sees what lies there," replied Miriel. "It judges not by strength of arm or skill with blade, but by the purity of purpose and the courage of the soul. Those who would pass must face their deepest fears and overcome them." The six companions stood in silence, each lost in thought of what terrors might lie hidden in the depths of their own hearts. The wind stirred the surface of the lake, and ripples spread outward like the rings of a great stone cast into still water. "I will go first," said Thrandion at length. "I am the captain of our company, and the responsibility is mine." He walked to the water's edge and knelt upon the shore, placing his hands upon the surface of the lake. The water was cold as ice, and it seemed to pulse with a life of its own. "Watcher in the water," he called, his voice carrying clearly across the still air. "I am Thrandion, son of Beregar, and I seek passage to the secret path. I come not for gain or glory, but to prevent a great evil from awakening in the world." The water began to churn and bubble, and slowly a form rose from the depths. It was vast and terrible, with tentacles like the arms of a great tree, and eyes that burned with an inner fire. When it spoke, its voice was like the sound of waves upon a distant shore. "I know your heart, son of Númenor," it said. "You seek to prevent the awakening of the Balrog, but you carry within you a burden of guilt. You believe that your failure to foresee the enemy's plans has doomed your companions to death. Face this fear and overcome it, or be dragged down into the depths." The water around Thrandion began to glow with an eerie light, and visions appeared upon its surface. He saw his companions dying one by one, their faces twisted with accusation and despair. he saw the Balrog awakening, its flame consuming all the free peoples of Middle-earth. He saw himself standing alone among the ruin, the last witness to the triumph of darkness. "No," he said, his voice growing stronger, "I will not accept this fate. My companions are strong and brave, and they follow me of their own free will. Whatever happens, we face it together, and we do not yield to despair." The visions faded, and the Watcher's eyes seemed to burn less fiercely. "You have passed the test," it said, "but remember, courage without wisdom is mere foolishness. Do not let your nobility become your downfall." A path of stone appeared upon the water, leading from the shore to the cliff face on the far side. Thrandion stepped onto it, and though it seemed insubstantial, it bore his weight without difficulty. One by one, the others faced the Watcher's test. Aldenor confronted his fear of inadequacy, believing himself unworthy to stand among such noble companions. Dunhere faced his terror of the flame, remembering how fire had consumed his father's hall was but a child. Barahir confronted his wanderlust, fearing that his restless nature would lead him to abandon his friends in their hour of need. Each passed the test, though not without cost. The trials left them shaken and pale, but also stronger, for they had faced their deepest fears and overcome them. When Aragorn's turn came, the Watcher's eyes burned brighter than before. "You carry a burden greater than the others," it said. "You are the heir of Isildur, yet you flee from your destiny. You fear that you will fail, as your ancestor failed, and that your weakness will doom the world. Beat." The vision that appeared showed Aragorn standing in the ruins of Minas Tirith, the ring of power upon his finger, his eyes burning with the same fire that consumed the Nazgûl. He saw himself becoming what he fought against, corrupted by the very power he sought to destroy. "I am not my ancestor," said Aragorn firmly. "I will not make his mistakes. If I must face the ring, I will find the strength to resist it, but I will not let fear of failure prevent me from trying." The Watcher nodded approvingly. "Well spoken, heir of Isildur. But remember, the blood of kings is not always a blessing. Sometimes it is a curse that must be borne with grace." Finally, it was Miriel's turn. The elf lady approached the water with serene composure, but when the Watcher's eyes fell upon her, they blazed with sudden fury. "Daughter of Feanor," it said, its voice like the crash of storm wave, "you carry the stain of the kinslaying, and the blood of the Teleri cries out for justice. How dare you seek passage through these sacred waters?" The words of the Watcher fell upon Miriel like physical blows, and for the first time since revealing her true nature, the elf lady's composure cracked. Her face went pale as starlight, and her hands trembled as she knelt by the water's edge. "I carry the shame of my father's house," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was there when the ships burned at Alqualanda, when the blood of the Teleri stained the white shores of Eldamar. I did not draw a sword against my kindred, but neither did I stay my brother's hand. The guilt of that day has haunted me through all the long years of my exile." The water around her began to turn red, as though the ancient blood of the kinslaying flowed within its depths. Ghostly figures appeared upon the surface, the spirits of the Teleri, who had died by the swords of the Noldor, their faces twisted with anguish and accusation. "Justice," they whispered, their voices like the moaning of the wind. "Justice for the innocent dead. Justice for the ships that burned, for the haven that was defiled, for the trust that was broken." Miriel bowed her head, tears streaming down her face. "I cannot undo what was done. I cannot bring back the dead, or heal the wounds that my family inflicted. But I have spent 3 ages of the world trying to atone for those sins. I have fought against the darkness, protected the innocent, and stood as guardian over the free peoples. If that is not enough, then I accept whatever fate you would give me." The Watcher studied her with eyes that held the wisdom of ages. "You speak of atonement, daughter of Feanor. But what of your brothers? What of the oath that your father swore, and the curse that fell upon all his house?" "My brothers are dead," replied Miriel, her voice growing stronger. "They died in fire and fury, consumed by the very oath they swore. I alone survive of all my father's children, and I alone bear the burden of their deeds. But I will not let their madness define me. I have chosen a different path." "Have you?" asked the Watcher. "Or do you still hear the call of the Silmarils in your heart? Do you still feel the fire of your father's pride burning within you?" The vision changed, showing Miriel standing in a great hall where 3 jewels blazed with the light of the 2 trees. They were beautiful beyond description, perfect in their radiance, and they called to her with voices that promised power and glory beyond measure. "Take us," they whispered. "We are yours by right of blood and fire. Your father made us, and you are his daughter. Claim what is yours, and let the world burn if it stands in your way." For a moment, Miriel reached toward the jewels, her eyes blazing with the same fire that had consumed her father and brothers. But then she stopped, her hand trembling in the— "No," she said, her voice firm with resolve. "I will not be ruled by the past. The Silmarils are beautiful, but they are not worth the price that was paid for them. I choose to serve the light, not to possess it." The vision faded, and the red tint began to leave the water. The ghostly figures of the Teleri looked upon her with eyes that held not accusation, but sorrow. "You have chosen well, daughter of Feanor," they said. "The blood debt cannot be erased, but it can be balanced by good deeds. Go forward, and may your path lead to redemption." The Watcher's eyes dimmed, and its voice took on a gentler tone. "You have faced the shadow of your past, and chosen to walk in the light. This is the hardest test of all, for it requires not courage, but wisdom. You may pass, but remember, the choices of the present matter more than the sins of the past." The stone path extended to include Miriel, and she stepped onto it, with tears still flowing down her face. Her companions gathered around her, offering what comfort they could. "I am sorry you had to witness that," she said. "The shame of my house is not something I speak of lightly." "You have nothing to be ashamed of," said Thrandion firmly. "You were not responsible for your father's deed, and you have spent your life trying to make amends. That takes a courage greater than any warrior." Aragorn nodded in agreement. "We all carry the weight of our ancestors' choices. What matters is what we do with that burden." The path led them across the dark water to the far shore, where the cliff face rose like a wall of granite. But as they approached, they could see that the stone was not solid. There were cracks and fissures in the rock, barely visible to the eye. "The entrance to the secret path," said Miriel, her composure returning. "It was hidden by the craft of the Eldar, and it will open only to those who know the proper word." She placed her hand upon the stone and spoke in the ancient tongue, words of power that had been old when the world was young. The rock trembled and groaned, and slowly a section of the cliff face swung inward, revealing a passage that led into the heart of the mountain. "The path of the second-born," she said. "It will take us to the very heart of Khazad-dûm, but the way is long and dark. We must be prepared for anything." As they entered the passage, the stone door swung shut behind them, and they were plunged into darkness. But Miriel raised her hand, and a soft light began to glow from her fingers. Not the harsh light of fire, but the gentle radiance of the stars. "The light of Arendil," she said. "It will guide us through the dark places, and it will not fail while hope remains in our hearts." The passage was narrow and winding, carved from the living rock by tools more delicate than any made by mortal hand. The walls were smooth as glass, and strange symbols were etched into the stone, words in the Tengwar script that spoke of friendship and alliance between the peoples of Middle-earth. "The dwarves must never have known of this passage," said Barahir, running his fingers along the carved symbol. "These are elvish runes, and they speak of gifts freely given." "The path was made in secret," replied Miriel. "It was meant to be used only in times of great need, when the friendship between our peoples was threatened. I had hoped never to walk this way again." They descended deeper into the mountain, following the winding path as it led them through chambers vast and small. Sometimes the way was so narrow that they had to walk single file, their shoulders brushing the walls. Other times, it opened into halls so large that their light could not reach the ceiling. It was in one of these great chambers that they heard the first sound of pursuit, the distant howling of wolves echoing through the tunnels behind them. "They have found the entrance," said Aragorn grimly. "The enemy's servants are not far behind." "Then we must move faster," replied Thrandion. "How much farther to the chamber of Mazarbul?" Miriel paused, listening to sounds that the others could not hear. "Not far now, but there is something else. I hear the sound of hammers and picks. The dwarves are indeed here, and they work with desperate haste." As they pressed on through the darkness, the sounds grew louder. The ring of metal on stone, the creak of wooden beam, the voices of dwarves raised in song and labor. But there was something else, a sound like the breathing of some vast beast, coming from the deepest parts of the mountain. "The Balrog stirs," whispered Miriel. "We may already be too late." The passage emerged into a vast hall carved from the living rock, its ceiling lost in shadow high above. Great pillars of stone supported the weight of the mountain, and between them stretched rows of stone shelves filled with books and scrolls. This was the chamber of Mazarbul, the Hall of Records, where the dwarves had kept the chronicles of their people since the founding of Khazad-dûm. But the chamber was not empty. Throughout the hall, dwarves labored with desperate urgency, their picks and hammers ringing against the stone. They had built barricades across the entrances, and their weapons lay close at hand, ready for battle. At the center of the hall stood a figure that could only be Balin's son of Fundin. He was old, his beard white as snow, but his eyes still burned with the fire of his youth. He directed the work with the authority of one long accustomed to command. "Lord Balin," called Thrandion as the companions entered the chamber. "We are friends, come to warn you of great danger." The dwarf lord turned, his hand moving to his axe. But when he saw Miriel, his eyes widened with surprise and recognition. "An elf lady," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "It has been many years since one of the firstborn walked in the halls of Khazad-dûm. You are welcome here, though I fear you have come at an ill time." "We know of the danger that stirs in the depths," replied Miriel. "We have come to help prevent the awakening of the Balrog." Balin's face grew grim. "Then you know more than we did when we came here. We sought to reclaim our ancient home, but we found it changed. The lower levels are filled with orcs and worse things, and in the deepest halls, something stirs that fills our bravest warriors with terror. The servants of the enemy are already here," said Aragorn. "They work to wake the Balrog and bend it to their will. How many dwarves are with you?" 37, replied Balin. "All that remained of my original company. We had hoped to hold the upper levels until more of our people could join us, but the enemy grows stronger each day." A young dwarf came running from one of the side passages, his face pale with fear. "Lord Balin," he gasped, "the orcs have broken through the eastern barricade. They come in great numbers, and their leader bears the Red Hand banner." "The mouth of Sauron's servants," said Thrandion grimly. "They waste no time in pressing their attack." Balin hefted his axe, its blade gleaming in the torchlight. "Then we shall give them a fight they will remember. Dwarves do not yield their halls easily. You cannot stand against them alone," said Dunher. "But together we might hold them long enough to prevent the awakening." The sound of marching feet echoed through the passages, growing ever closer. The orcs came in disciplined ranks, their armor black and their weapons keen. At their head strode a figure in dark mail, his face hidden beneath a helm of iron. In his hand he bore a staff topped with a red gem that pulsed with malevolent light. "Surrender the chamber," called the dark figure, his voice like the grinding of millstones. "You are outnumbered and outmatched. Yield now, and your deaths will be swift." "We are the children of Olli," replied Balin, his voice ringing with pride. "We do not yield to the servants of darkness. Come then, and taste the bite of dwarf steel." The battle was joined with a clash of weapons and a cry of rage that echoed through the hall. The orcs came on in waves, their numbers seeming endless, but the dwarves fought with the fury of their ancestors, their axes cleaving through the ranks of the enemy. Thrandion and his companions threw themselves into the fray, their weapons singing as they cut down orc after orc. Aldanor's bow hummed as he sent arrow after arrow into the enemy ranks, while Dunhere's sword carved a path through the press of battle. Miriel stood in the center of the hall, her hands weaving patterns in the air as she cast spells of protection strength. Her voice rose in song, words of power that made the very stones of the mountain tremble. But the enemy was too numerous, and slowly the defenders were pushed back. The dark figure at the head of the orcs raised his staff, and the red gem blazed with sudden fire. Where its light fell, the dwarves faltered, their strength sapped by the malevolent power. "The sorcerer!" gasped Balin, his axe dripping with orc blood. "He is the key to their power. If we can bring him down." Aragorn saw the truth of it at once. The dark figure was not merely a war leader, but a sorcerer of great power, one who channeled the will of the enemy himself. While he lived, the orcs would continue to press their attack with supernatural fury. "Cover me," he called to his companions, and then he was moving through the battle, his sword cutting a path toward the sorcerer. The dark figure saw him coming and raised his staff, sending a bolt of red fire blazing toward the ranger. But Aragorn was ready. He rolled aside, the flame passing inches from his face, and came up running. His blade struck the sorcerer's staff, and the red gem cracked with a sound like breaking glass. The effect was immediate. The orcs wavered, their supernatural fury fading as the sorcerer's power was broken. But the dark figure was not finished. He drew a sword of black iron and met Aragorn's attack with skill born of centuries of warfare. "You cannot stop what has already begun," he snarled as their blades met. "The Balrog stirs, and soon it will wake. When it does, all your efforts will be as dust in the wind." Even as he spoke, a sound rose from the depths of the mountain, a roar that shook the very foundations of the hall. The Balrog was indeed stirring, and its voice was like the sound of the world ending. "No," said Miriel, her face pale with sudden understanding. "The awakening has begun. We are too late." But Thrandion stepped forward, his hand moving to the crystal that Elrond had given him. "Perhaps not," he said. "We may yet have time to prevent the full awakening, but we must act quickly." The battle raged on, but now it was a race against time. In the depths below, the Balrog was stirring from its long slumber, and with each passing moment, its power grew stronger. The fate of Middle-earth hung in the balance, and the defenders of Amon Sûl faced their greatest test. The roar from the depths grew louder, and the very stones of the mountain began to tremble. Cracks appeared in the walls of the chamber of Mazarbul, and a red glow began to seep upward from the lower level. The Balrog of Morgoth was awakening, and its fury shook the roots of the world. "We must reach the deep hall," said Miriel, her voice tight with urgency. "If the Balrog fully awaken, nothing will be able to stop it. But in the first moments of its rising, it may yet be vulnerable." The sorcerer laughed, a sound like breaking stone. "You are too late, elf witch. The spells of binding are already broken. The flame of Udun rises, and with it comes the doom of all who stand against the Dark Lord." But even as he spoke, Aragorn's blade found its mark. The ranger's sword pierced the sorcerer's heart, and the dark figure fell with a cry of rage and disbelief. The orcs, seeing their leader slain, began to waver and retreat. "The way is clear," called Balin, his axe still bloody from the battle. "But I fear what we will find in the depths. The lower halls have been sealed for good reason. The thing that dwells there is beyond the power of mortal weapon." Thrandion drew forth the crystal that Elrond had given him, and it blazed with silver light. "We have more than mortal weapons," he said. "We have the light of the evening star and the courage of free hearts. Come, let us face this darkness together." See, the companions and their dwarf allies descended into the depths of Khazad-dûm, following passages that grew ever hotter as they went deeper. The walls glowed with their own inner fire, and the air itself seemed to burn in their lungs. They came at last to a vast chamber that stretched beyond the reach of sight. This was the heart of the mountain, where the dwarves had delved deepest in their search for Mithril. And in the center of the chamber, Rising from a chasm that seemed to have no bottom came the Balrog. It was a creature of shadow and flame, terrible to behold. Its body was wreathed in fire, and its eyes burned like stars fallen into darkness. In its hand, it bore a whip of flame, and upon its brow was a crown of iron that glowed white-hot. "Who dares to disturb my slumber?" it roared, its voice like the sound of avalanches. "I am the flame of Udun, the shadow of death. Before me, mountains crumble and armies flee in terror. We are the free peoples of Middle-earth," replied Thrandion, his voice steady despite the fear in his heart. "We come to prevent your awakening and to cast you back into the darkness from which you came." The Balrog laughed, a sound like the roaring of great furnaces. "You? A handful of mortals and one fading elf? You think to challenge me, who fought at the side of Melkor himself? You are gnats before a hurricane." It raised its whip, and the air itself caught fire. The lash struck the ground where the companions stood, and the stone exploded into fragments. They scattered, seeking cover among the broken pillars and fallen stones. "The light!" cried Miriel. "Use the light of Erendil. It is the one thing the creatures of Morgoth cannot endure." Thrandion held up the crystal, and it blazed with radiance that drove back the shadows. The Balrog recoiled, its flames dimming for a moment, but then it roared with renewed fury, and the fire burned hotter than before. "The light of the Silmarils," it snarled. "I remember that cursed radiance. It will not save you, as it did not save your kindred in Gondolin." The battle was joined, but it was hopeless from the start. The Balrog was a creature of the Elder Day, one of the Maiar corrupted by Morgoth's malice. Their weapons could not pierce its hide of flame and shadow, and their arrows turned to ash in the air. One by one, the defenders fell. Dunhere was struck down by the creature's whip, his body consumed by fire. Aldenor's bow snapped in the terrible heat, and he was forced to flee behind a pillar of stone. Even Balin and his dwarves, brave as they were, could not stand against such power. "We cannot defeat it," gasped Aragorn, his sword glowing red from the heat. "It is too strong, too ancient. We need a miracle." It was then that Miriel stepped forward, her face set with grim determination. "There is one way," she said, "but it will cost everything." She began to sing, not in the common tongue, but in the ancient language of Valinor. The words were of power and binding, the same spells that had been used to chain Morgoth himself in the depths of Mandos. The Balrog sensed the danger and turned its attention to her. Its whip lashed out, but the silver light of the crystal formed a barrier around her. Still she sang, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You cannot bind me," roared the Balrog. "I am flame imperishable, shadow eternal. No chain can hold me. No spell can bind me." But Miriel's song continued, and the very air began to shimmer with power. The words she sang were not merely of binding, but of sacrifice, the ancient magic that required the singer to give up their own life force to power the spell. "No," cried Thrandion, understanding what she meant to do. "There must be another way." "There is none," replied Miriel, her voice already growing faint. "I am the last of my father's house, and this is my chance for redemption. The sins of the kinslaying will be washed away as final act." The spell reached its crescendo, and chains of silver light began to wrap around the Balrog. It fought against them, its flames burning brighter than ever, but the bonds held firm. Slowly, inexorably, it was drawn back toward the chasm from which it had emerged. "This is not the end," roared the Balrog as the chains dragged it down. "I will return, and when I do, all the world will burn." But Miriel's sacrifice was not in vain. The binding held, and the creature of shadow and flame was pulled back into the depths of the earth. As it vanished into the chasm, the red glow faded from the walls, and the terrible heat began to dissipate. Miriel collapsed, her strength spent by the great spell. Thrandion caught her as she fell, and he could see that her life was ebbing away. "You have saved us all," he said, tears streaming down his face. "The world will remember your sacrifice. Remember instead that redemption is possible," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Even for the children of Fëanor, even for those who have walked in darkness." With those words, she passed from Middle-earth, her spirit departing for the halls of Mando. But her sacrifice had not been in vain. The Balrog was bound once more, and the threat to the free people was ended. In the days that followed the binding of the Balrog, the survivors made their way slowly back to the upper levels of Khazad-dûm. The halls that had echoed with the sounds of battle now lay silent, save for the dripping of water and the distant whisper of wind through stone passage. Thrandion bore the body of Míriel with reverence, for though she had been revealed as one of the Eldar, she had died as a friend and companion. Balin and his remaining dwarves sang the death songs of their people, honoring both the elf lady and their own fallen warriors. "She will be remembered in the halls of my fathers," said Balin, his voice heavy with grief. "Never has a debt been paid at such cost, nor honor purchased at such price." Aragorn walked in silence, his thoughts turned inward. The revelation of Míriel's true identity and the manner of her sacrifice had shaken him deeply. Here was one who had carried the burden of ancient sin, yet found the strength to choose redemption in the end. When they reached the chamber of Mizarble, they found it transformed. Where once there had been only darkness and the threat of evil, now there was a sense. The books and scrolls that had been scattered in the battle were being carefully gathered by the surviving dwarves, and torches burned with clean flame. "What will you do now?" asked Thrandion. "Will you remain here in Khazad-dûm, or will you return to your people?" Balin looked around the ancient hall, his eyes reflecting years of hope and disappointment. "We came here to reclaim our homeland, but I see now that the time is not yet right. The mountain still holds too many shadows, and we are too few to cleanse them all. We will return to the outside world and tell our people what we have learned." It was then that an unexpected voice spoke from the shadows. "Perhaps that would be wise, Lord Balin. The halls of Khazad-dûm have seen enough sorrow for one age." From the darkness stepped a figure that made them all gasp in wonder. He was tall and fair, with a long gray beard and robes that shifted color in the torchlight. In his hand, he bore a staff of white wood, and his eyes held the wisdom of ages. "Mithrandir!" cried Aragorn, recognizing the Grey Wizard. "How come you to be here?" "I felt the binding of the Balrog," replied Gandalf, for that was indeed who it was. "Such magic sends ripples through all the world, and I came to learn what had transpired. I arrived in time to see the last moments of Míriel's sacrifice." He approached the place where her body lay, and his face was grave with sorrow. "Míriel Fëanoriel," he said softly. "I knew her in the elder days, when the world was young and the light of the two trees shone upon Valinor. She was the fairest and wisest of Fëanor's children, and the only one to escape the madness that consumed her house. She spoke of redemption," said Thrandion. "In her final moment, she found peace." Gandalf nodded slowly. "And in finding peace, she gave it to others. The Balrog is bound once more, and the threat to Middle-earth is ended. But her sacrifice has accomplished more than that. It has shown that even the darkest sins can be forgiven, and that no one is beyond the hope of redemption." The wizard raised his staff, and a gentle light filled the chamber. Under its radiance, Míriel's body began to fade, becoming as insubstantial as mist. But as it disappeared, a single white flower appeared where she had lain, an asphodel of Valinor, its petals glowing with their own inner light. "She has passed beyond the circles of the world," said Gandalf. "Her spirit goes now to the halls of Mandos, where she will find the peace that eluded her in life. And in time, she may even be granted the grace to pass to the undying lands, redeemed at last from the curse of her father's house." The companions stood in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The great quest was ended, the Balrog bound, and the immediate threat to Middle-earth removed. But the cost had been high, and the memory of those who had fallen would remain with them always. "What of the Watchtower?" asked Aldenor at length. "Should we return to Amon Sûl?" "Aye," replied Thrandion. "Our watch is not ended, though our greatest trial may be past. The tower must be manned, and the Palantir guarded. There will be other threats, other danger to face. Gandalf smiled, the first time he had done so since his arrival, spoken like a true guardian of the realm. Yes, return to your tower. Watchers of Amon Sûl, keep your vigil and watch for the signs of coming storm. For though this battle is won, the war between light and darkness is far from over. As they prepared to leave the ancient halls of Khazad-dûm, Balin approached Thranduil with something in his hands. It was a small object, wrapped in silk, no larger than a man's fist. This was found among the sorcerer's possessions, he said. It is a Palantir, one of the seeing stones of the enemy. We dare not keep it, for it might be used to corrupt those who look into it. Thranduil accepted the dark stone with reverence, feeling its weight, both physical and spiritual. We will bear it to Rivendell, he said. Lord Elrond will know how to guard it, or destroy it, as wisdom dictates. The journey back to Amon Sûl took many days, for they traveled slowly, bearing their wounded and honoring their dead. But when at last they saw the familiar shape of Weathertop rising against the sky, their hearts were lightened. The tower stood as they had left it, its stones weathered but unbroken. The Palantir chamber had remained sealed, and when they unveiled the seeing stone, it blazed with clean silver light, free from the shadow that had touched it before. The corruption is cleansed, said Gandalf, studying the stone with his keen eyes. The binding of the Balrog has weakened Sauron's power, and his influence over the Palantiri is broken, at least for now. In the days that followed, messengers came from all the free peoples to hear the tale of what had transpired in the depths of Khazad-dûm. Kings and lords sent their thanks, and the names of the defenders were remembered in song and story. But for Thranduil and his remaining companions, the greatest reward was simpler: the knowledge that they had stood against the darkness and prevailed. The watchtower of Amon Sûl stood once more as a beacon of hope in a world too often shrouded in shadow. And though Miriel was gone, her sacrifice was not forgotten. In the years that came after, when times grew dark and hope seemed lost, the defenders would remember her word, that redemption was possible for all who sought it, and that even the deepest darkness could be overcome by those who were willing to pay the price. The watch continued, as it always had and always would, until the ending of the world, for the price of freedom was eternal vigilance, and the watchers of Amon Sûl would never abandon their post. Thus ends the tale of the defenders of Amon Sûl, who stood against the awakening of ancient evil and paid the ultimate price for victory. Their names are remembered still in the halls of Rivendell and the courts of men, and their deeds echo through the ages as a testament to the power of courage, sacrifice, and hope. Yet the greatest twist in their tale was not revealed until the very end, when Gandalf spoke privately with Thranduil as the others slept. The wizard's eyes held a strange light as he revealed the final secret. "There is something you should know," he said quietly. Miriel was not merely one of Feanor's children. She was his daughter, his only daughter, hidden away when her brothers swore their terrible oath. She was the child who might have turned the fate of the Noldor, had she not chosen exile over the madness of her kin. Thranduil's eyes widened with understanding. Then, her sacrifice was not just the redemption of one elf, but the redemption of an entire bloodline, finished Gandalf. In choosing to give her life to bind the Balrog, she broke the curse that had held the House of Feanor in thrall since the darkening of Valinor. That is why her binding was so powerful. It carried with it the weight of all her family's unfulfilled oaths and unredeemed sin. The wizard smiled sadly. She knew what she was and what her sacrifice would mean. In the end, the daughter of Feanor succeeded where her father and brothers had failed. She chose love over pride, sacrifice over glory, and in doing so, she saved not just Middle-earth, but her own soul. And so the watch continued, under stars that shone a little brighter for the light that one elf lady had brought into the world through her willing sacrifice. The defenders of Amon Sûl stood guard over the realms of the free, knowing that even in the darkest hour, redemption and hope could still triumph over evil and despair. Here ends the chronicle of the defenders of Amon Sûl, as set down by the scribes of Rivendell in the year 1980 of the Third Age, being a true account of the binding of the Balrog and the redemption of Miriel Feanoriel, last daughter of the House of Feanor.